I recently bought a Steam Deck and love it when I'm using it, but the majority of the time, it's just sitting there. Sad. What if there was a way to get more value out of your Steam Deck when not in use? Well, that's exactly why I made this video, where I'm going to show you how I set up my Steam Deck as an efficient but useful home server. It can automate my home, stream my collection of shows to my TV, block spammy or even malicious ads, run game servers, host a website, the list goes on. So let's get started. Getting this all figured out wasn't necessarily easy, but I finally landed on what I think was the best solution for running services on a Steam Deck. If you don't really care to hear the whole process, feel free to skip ahead. As with all of my videos, there should be timestamps or chapters to make it easy to do so. So what I originally wanted to do with my Steam Deck was use the built-in SteamOS operating system to set up something like Docker using Portainer to run things like Home Assistant, Jellyfin, and whatnot. And actually, Radal did a video doing exactly that, and it works great until you decide to update SteamOS, in which case it would probably get completely overwritten. And that's because SteamOS is what's called an immutable distro. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But basically, that means the operating system, or at least everything that's not in the home directory, essentially, is just an image that gets overwritten every time there's an update. So anything you do in something like /etc or /user is going to get overwritten. This means installing Docker is sort of out of the question if I wanted to have my server last every time there's an update to SteamOS. Now, my main plan of what I was hoping to get working was to install DistroBox, which is basically an easy way to run containerized distributions alongside whatever Linux distribution you're running. So, for example, I could run Ubuntu in a container that has all of the privileges and file access as SteamOS does, but it's running in a container. And so my thought was, I suck at Arch Linux and I know Debian really well, so I'll just set up a Debian container that I can run all of my server stuff in. But I ran into lots of issues not having root access because things can't be installed not in the home directory. Yeah, so that was all a pain. So I eventually just settled to do something a bit easier that was still convenient and honestly just makes sense. Before I get into that though, I should mention something else that's really easy and convenient, which is getting a close shave thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Manscaped. I've talked about Manscaped in the past when they released their beard trimmer, which I've been happily using for months now, but they just keep cranking out awesome new products such as this, the Handyman. It delivers a quick, close shave with a unique dual blade system. It features a standard foil shaver as well as a long hair leveler blade to knock down longer stubble. It features up to 60 minutes of runtime and can quick charge in just 5 minutes with a standard USB-C cable. It's IPX7 rated, so you can easily keep it clean by rinsing it off, or you can even shave in the shower. The Handyman is super compact, making it easy to maneuver while grooming, and also perfect for travel. Whether you need something to take on the go, or you're just looking for a convenient and quick way to handle your grooming needs, you should definitely check out the Handyman from Manscaped. When you decide to pull the trigger, you can use code HARDWAREHAVEN at checkout to get 20% off plus free shipping. So go check out the Handyman, your face will thank you. All right, back to the whole Steam Deck server thing. What did I decide to do? Well, I just decided to install another operating system onto an external drive. Now, this might sound like a cop-out, but in reality, it actually makes it really easy to just be gaming on the go, and then when you want to put your Steam Deck into server mode, you just turn it off, plug in a dock, or in my case, just a dongle, and then reboot into an external SSD that's running, in my case, Debian 12. Then I installed CasaOS so that I could run containers like Home Assistant, Jellyfin, etc., while the Steam Deck just sat there sipping power. And another cool benefit of this setup is that there aren't any substantial changes to the SteamOS install. So if you want to try the same thing out, what all do you need? Well, obviously you need a Steam Deck, but alongside that, you either need to have a dock, or in my case, just a USB-C dongle. Now, ideally this will have at least 3 USB ports, but as you notice, in my case, it only has 2. And the reason we need 3 is we need one for our operating system, one for a keyboard or keyboard and mouse, and then another to have our install media to actually install the operating system. But I have an SD card reader, so I actually just used an SD card and that worked fine. You can also plug in another hub to plug in like your mouse and keyboard to make that all work. But yeah, you need a USB hub or dock that has multiple USB ports. You also need a drive to install the operating system on, which in my case, I just used this crucial 1TB SSD with a little USB adapter. But you can use an external drive, or you can just buy a drive like this and then buy one of the many available USB drive enclosures or adapters. You'll also need a flash drive, or in my case, an SD card, to use as the install media. And lastly, you'll want an Ethernet cable, and I guess an Ethernet port on your adapter or dock, because you will want to run this wired, not over Wi-Fi. You can run it over Wi-Fi, but it's just going to be a much better experience if you connect this up to your router or a network switch or whatever your local network looks like. Okay, so now that we have our monstrosity of stuff plugged in, let's actually head over to the desk and start setting this all up. All right, cool. I'm over here at my desk and we're gonna start setting up this Steam Deck, which I have set up right here. It's kind of hard to see, but I have the USB hub plugged in, and back here is my SSD. And then I actually have another hub plugged in for mouse and keyboard, which is over here on my desk. And then I have network plugged in as well as HDMI, which is why you don't see anything on screen, because it's actually recording via screen capture into OBS, but we have everything ready to go. And yeah, let's get started. So first thing, we are in desktop mode here in the Steam Deck because we need to set up one thing, which is Clover. And I'll have this link in the description, but this is the Steam Deck Clover dual boot on GitHub. And also really quick, huge thanks to Ryan Rudolph for putting this all together and making this pretty easy and accessible. But we can go down here to these instructions on how to install it, which is fairly easy. So we need to open up the console. So I can hit the super key and type in console. Okay, and then we're going to CD into our home directory, which we already are. And then we can copy paste this over to here and hit enter. And then all we need to do now is CD into that directory it made. And then we're going to add the permission here to run this as an executable. And then all we have to do is actually run that. Now here, if you haven't set up a sudo password, it will have you set up a sudo password. I already did, so I'm just gonna type mine in. And then you'll get this prompt here. And this isn't super helpful because we do have SteamOS installed, but we're not installing Windows. So I'm just gonna hit SteamOS and then hit OK. And that should be totally fine. We should be good to go. So we can exit out of all of this and then shut down. Okay, so now we need to figure out how we're going to install Debian onto this external SSD. And to do that, I'm going to use something called Ventoy. And you can set up Ventoy either on a flash drive or, in my case, an SD card, just because I have an SD card reader on that USB hub and not an open USB port. So all you have to do is go to the Ventoy website, which I'll have linked in the description, and then you can download this .zip and then extract it. Now we also need our Debian ISO, and I'll have a link for that in the description as well. But essentially you can go to Debian's website and then select the AMD 64 for Debian 12. Now I already downloaded and extracted Ventoy as well as the Debian ISO. So in this folder here, we can see we have my Debian 12.1, as well as this folder for Ventoy 1.0.94. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to plug in my SD card really quick. And then I'm going to actually open up the Ventoy folder we just made and run this ventoy to disk.exe. And then here in this window, I can select this generic storage device, which is my SD card, and hit install. And I'm going to type yes, because all my data is going to be lost on this, which is fine. Okay, cool. And we have Ventoy installed. It popped up here. And now all we have to do is just drag this Debian ISO into here. And once that transfers over, we have Ventoy installed and our Debian ISO ready to go. Sweet, so it's done. I'm going to eject it. And then now I'm gonna plug this SD card into my USB hub, and then we'll turn the Steam Deck on. Okay, cool, so I have the SD card plugged into the USB hub. Now when I power on the Steam Deck, I'm gonna hold down the volume down button and hit the power button to get into the boot menu. Cool. And then here I'm using my keyboard, but you can actually use the D-pad and the A button to select your installer. And you can see we actually have this Clover boot manager here, which is what we installed earlier, but we're going to go down to this USB device. And you can hit Enter or A. And then I'm going to install Debian 12 and then normal mode. Now, while this is booting up, one thing you should note is if you do this without an external display, it's probably going to be sideways on your Steam Deck, which isn't great, but it's totally fine. You can just kind of tilt it like this and get through it. But I'm using an external display with a capture card, so that's why it's showing up like this. And we're going to hit graphical install. And I'm going to skip through some of these settings because some are just pretty obvious and dependent on where you live, your time zone, things like that. So I'm going to skip a lot of those, like English, United States, American English, and so on. Okay, in this menu, we need to select our Ethernet interface, and this is a bit tricky. So this is our wireless adapter that's on the Steam Deck itself, and then these are two USB adapters, because I actually have two USB hubs plugged in. One of them is the one that I actually have a network connection plugged into, and the other isn't. You should only have one here, hopefully, but I'm going to select one of these and see if it works, and then if not, we'll select the other one. So I'm going to select the one that ends in F1. Okay, so I'm going to hit continue. That wasn't the right one. And now I'm going to select the one that ends in 1E. And this should be the adapter that's plugged into my network, and it looks like it is, since it went much quicker that time. Cool, so that was correct, and now we have where we can type in a host name. I'm just going to type in steam-debian. And then for the domain name, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to type in local. Now here's where you can set up your root password. Just make this something you're not going to forget. I'm typing in a super secure password for this video. Now here you can type in your name. I'm just going to put Haven and then make Haven my username. And then I'm going to have a password for this user. Once again, super secure password. Time zone. Now here we're going to select where we want to install Debian, and I'm going to use the entire disk and then find the 1 terabyte drive, which is this guy. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put all files in one partition. Finish. Yes. All right, for package manager, I'm just going to select my country and then the top one here. We don't need a proxy, so we can just hit enter. And for popularity contest, I'm just going to hit no. Okay, so here's where things might get a bit controversial if you are familiar with Linux and self-hosting. I'm going to get rid of GNOME, but I am going to select XFCE. Now, typically when you run a server, you wouldn't run a desktop environment as well, but I have some good reasons for that, so just trust me on this one. And then I'm also going to install the SSH server just in case I want to connect to this server using SSH rather than having to plug a mouse and keyboard into it. And this will take a little bit, but once it's done, we should have Debian installed. Okay, so we're pretty much wrapped up with the install here. I need to select yes for the system clock, but everything should be done now. Installation complete, and we can hit continue to reboot. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to hit continue, and I'm also, once it gets to this next little screen here, I'm going to unplug the SD card. Now, when we boot into the Steam Deck, we'll actually be met with, okay, I wasn't expecting a Rick and Morty background here, but we're met with Clover. So we can actually select which OS we want to boot into. And once again, you can actually do this with the D-pad on the Steam Deck. But we're going to boot into Debian. All right, and here I'm going to go ahead and sign into the root user. So root, and then whatever the root password we set up was. Okay. And this is a little bit wonky on the screen capture because you can actually see on the Steam Deck down here is the main display. I'm going to awkwardly go up to Applications, Settings, Display, and get this sorted out here. Okay, so I did a little bit of display configuration now, so you can see on the Steam Deck, we do have a display right now, but we also have on my capture card sort of our main display. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go into the terminal emulator here and type in a few commands. So we're going to first type in apt install curl and sudo, just like that. Hit Y for yes. And then we're going to add our Haven user, or whatever username you made, to the sudo group so that we can use sudo when logged in as that user. So to do that, we can type in usermod, then dash little a, big G, sudo, which is the group, and then the username of your user, which for me is Haven. Then we can type in exit, and I'm going to log out, switch user, and then log in as Haven. Hopefully I don't have to redo my displays here. Okay, so I'm not really used to XFCE, and I don't know why in the Haven user I can't set up my display to have the bar and everything down here, but we'll just keep rolling with it. Most likely you'll be doing this just on the Steam Deck display anyway, so it shouldn't be that big of a deal. But in the terminal, we want to install what's called CasaOS, which is a pretty cool application, essentially, or collection of applications that can help you run a simple home server and run different containerized applications. If we go to their website, you can see this Get Started page, and it actually has a really simple command here to set up CasaOS, and it's tested on Debian 11 and recommended, and Debian 12 is very similar, so it should run just fine. So back in the Steam Deck, we can type in curl -fs, and then capital S, capital L, https://get.casaos.io, and then we'll put this line here, which is a pipe, and then we'll type in sudo bash, and we'll hit enter. It'll ask for our sudo password, or our user password, and we can hit enter. And this should run for a few minutes, and then once it's done, we should have CasaOS up and running, and we can start doing some cool stuff. All right, cool. So it looks like it's done, and you can see up here it says we can go to http 192.168.10.168, and that's our local IP address for the Steam Deck, but it may change because our network is probably using, or your network is probably using DHCP, which means this IP address could change. I'm not going to dive way into it, but if you can log into your router settings, which is probably at 192.168.1.1 or 0.1, you can maybe set up DHCP to basically provide a static mapping for this. So for me, I use a thing called pfSense for my home router, and in this page here, I can actually find where it says Steam Debian at 192.168.10.168, and I could hit this plus mark here to make a static mapping, and then the IP address for this device would never change, which makes it easy to get to that server. So once again, I'm not going to dive way into this. You can look up how to map a static DHCP mapping on your router, or you can look into some other options like setting a static IP on Debian. I'm not going to dive into that, but you can hopefully figure that out on your own. But for now, this IP address should at least be the same for a little bit. So over to my desktop, I'm actually going to go to that 192.168.10.168 and hit enter. And we should land at CasaOS. How cool. So I'm going to hit go, and we can make a username and then a password that has to at least be 8 digits, and hit create. And I'm going to hit cancel for now. And now we're at the CasaOS dashboard. And from here, we can do a few things like see our storage. We can see we have 1 terabyte. We could also see the other drives in the system, like my SD card, as well as my storage for my Steam Deck. But the cool thing about CasaOS is that we can easily set up apps using this app store, which is running a thing called Docker, but don't worry about the backend that much. So I'm going to go ahead and install Home Assistant, and then also install Jellyfin. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep dive of CasaOS in this video, but if you want to learn more, you can watch this video here, which I'll have linked in the description, where I do a deep dive into how to set up CasaOS and a few different applications, and that might be more helpful, but for now, I'm just going to show some basics. So now we have Home Assistant installed, so I can just click on that, and it may take a few minutes for this to get set up, but once it is set up, we should land at this page, and I'm going to start setting up Home Assistant. All right, so it's going to be hard to see, but I set up this studio backlight here, and now I can actually change the color of it pretty easily. See, it's like pink now, and I'm going to go back to a nice warm white again. Now, I really want to do a deep dive into Home Assistant, and I haven't done that yet, but there are plenty of videos out there on the internet that you can check out on how to configure things like automations and scenes and all sorts of cool stuff. Like I said, I want to make a video deep diving into that, but I just haven't yet, so my bad. But Home Assistant is up and running, and it's fairly easy to go in and start setting things up. Now next is Jellyfin, and Jellyfin lets you stream your own collection of movies and TV shows to TVs, phones, that sort of thing. It's almost like your own private Netflix. I'm not going to go into how to acquire those shows or movies. I personally rip off things from Blu-rays and DVDs that we own, and actually if you're interested in that, there's another video that I'll link in the description, but I'm going to just copy those files up to the server and show you how we can get started that way. So if I go to Jellyfin and I go to settings, you can see there's a whole bunch of stuff here, but down here we have in our container this media directory, and we have that mapped from our server in this /data/media. And if you're kind of confused what's going on there, don't worry. We can just go to files and then data and then media. And here we already have these folders for movies, music, and TV shows. So under TV shows, I'm actually going to upload a folder. Now on my work NAS, I have this for examples, but I have the Office US here. I'm going to just drag that in and let it upload. Okay, so that's uploaded, and so I have this folder called the Office US. Oops, sorry. And then within that, I have Season 1. I'm going to delete this DS store. That's a Mac thing. In Season 1, we can see I have the 6 episodes that are in Season 1 of The Office. Now, if I go back to our dashboard, I can click on Jellyfin, and that's going to put me here, where I can hit Next, set up a username and password. And then here I need to set up a media library, which is going to be our TV show library. So I can hit Add Media Library. And then under Content Type, I'm going to hit Shows. And then we're going to map a folder. So here I can go to that /media folder, and then TV shows, and then hit OK. Then OK. And then I'm going to hit Next and Next. This gets a little bit into the weeds of Jellyfin. For now, I would just leave this as default because that's fine, because unless you set up how to connect to this from outside of your home network, it's not really going to be a security issue or anything. I would leave this UPnP thing unchecked unless you want to set that up and access Jellyfin from outside your house. And then we're done. We can hit Finish and sign back in. And how cool, we can see under shows, we have the Office US. And if I click on this, I can see Season 1 and all of the episodes. And I can hit play on Diversity Day, probably my favorite episode of The Office ever. And we can see we're streaming it. Now, there's a lot more you can do with Jellyfin. Like if I go to this admin dashboard, I can go down to playback, and then under hardware acceleration, I haven't actually tried this, but you should be able to set up hardware acceleration using this VA API, and then select H.264 and HEVC, and then hit apply. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to take advantage of the GPU that's on the Steam Deck and help transcode video. So if you have a 4K video, but you're watching on your phone and you want to watch it at 720p to save data, it can in real time transcode that from a big 4K file down to something much smaller with a lower bit rate. And yeah, I haven't tried that yet. So I'm going to see if that works. We're going to go back to the Office here, and this does not need transcoding because it's a very low quality video. But if I tried to just change it to a different bit rate, that should force transcoding. And we can see that it is transcoding, and it looks like it's working. If I go back to our dashboard, we can see the CPU is barely doing anything, which pretty much means that we're using hardware acceleration to transcode rather than the CPU. So pretty cool. Now there's a lot more you can do with CasaOS. You can go into the App Store and install things like Pi-hole, for example, to block ads. They actually just recently added this MineOS, which you can use to run Minecraft servers. You can use emulator.js to have your own emulators of like NES and SNES games in your web browser. There's a whole lot you can do here, and then you can also do custom installs to install containers from outside the App Store. So there's a lot you can do with CasaOS, and I have more info in that video like I mentioned, so definitely go check that out. All right, so we have CasaOS up and running. We have Home Assistant and Jellyfin, no issues. So what happens if we turn this off? Well, I'm just gonna hit the power button really quick. Shut down. And we're going to sort of simulate what would happen if we were to be playing on our Steam Deck and then decide to turn it down and just plug it in and turn it on. Okay, well, unfortunately, this booted into SteamOS, which is a little bit unfortunate. So we're going to turn it off. And now we're going to boot back up into it using the boot manager like we did earlier. I had this happen with me when I first did the installs, so hopefully we should be able to get it fixed. So I'm going to hold down the volume down button and turn it back on again, and then select the Clover bootloader once again. All right, so back in the Clover bootloader, we should be able to see these two options, and I'm going to go back into Debian Linux once again. And here's a big issue. We just booted into Debian, but it prompts us with the login. So CasaOS isn't going to start running. If I try to pull it up over here, you can maybe see it. Oh, it is running. Okay, I thought this wasn't going to work because our user wasn't signed in, but it is working because I guess it's running as a service that's not tied to the desktop environment or something like that. I'm not a Linux desktop guy, so I don't entirely know this, but I still want the brightness to be fixed on the screen, which is another issue I was going to tackle. So to do that, I think I'll need this to automatically log into our Haven user. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and log in really quick. So I'm going to open up the console here, and then I'm going to type in sudo-e/etc/lightdm/lightdm.conf and hit enter, sudo password, or user password, I should say. And then we're going to scroll all the way down till we get past this seat : asterisk. And there's a few things we're going to want to change. Where it says auto login user, we're going to get rid of this £. Is that the word? And then we're going to type in our username. And then this auto login timeout, we're going to make sure is uncommented and set to 0. And that's basically just going to immediately log us into the Haven user. So let's test that out really quick. Oh, to finish this, we need to hit Control X and then Y and enter. And now we can say sudo reboot, hit enter. And hopefully this time it'll automatically pull us into the Clover bootloader. I'm curious. Yeah, okay, cool. So this time it took us to Clover, and we'll once again select Debian Linux, hit enter. And perfect, it brought us straight into the desktop, no prompt to log in. Because I want to go down here. You can't really see probably, but I'm going to go to Settings, Power Manager. I'll drag it up to the screen capture over here. And then under Display Power Management here, I want to say put to sleep after 1 minute and switch off after 1 minute as well. We'll just try that. And then plugged in as well. We'll do the same thing. We'll say switch off after 1 minute. And then we'll hit close. And let's see what happens here. We're going to wait 1 minute and just see what it does. In the meantime, we can see that CasaOS is still running just fine. We can go to Home Assistant. Haha, perfect. The display is off. We can see there's no video here on the screen cap. We can still get to everything in our server just fine. Pretty cool. Now really quick, I'm going to boot back into SteamOS instead of Debian, because here we should be able to make one more important little tweak. All right, cool. So we're back in desktop mode, and there actually is this cool little Clover toolbox icon here. And I'm going to say execute, type in my password, and then right here we can click boot, okay. And this is that same menu as we looked at earlier to decide the default OS, but now we have this option to click last OS. And so this will be helpful because we can hit okay. And now, whatever our last operating system was is what Clover will boot into by default, which if our server was running last and for some reason the system crashes, when it reboots, it'll just boot back into Debian for our server. But if we start the Steam Deck without the USB hub plugged in, we won't have that drive to boot into, so Clover will just boot into SteamOS like normal. So pretty cool. So let's test that out really quick. All right, so in Clover, I'm going to boot into Debian really quick. All right, so we've booted into Debian, and then now in the web browser, I'm going to refresh CasaOS, and it's up and running like we would expect. I'm going to restart it really quick and just make sure that it boots back into Debian. All right, so Steam Deck is restarting, and it looks like Debian Linux is going to automatic boot in 10 seconds. By the way, I think you can adjust the timeout in those Clover settings in the SteamOS desktop thing as well. All right, so we auto-booted into Debian, and this should also auto-boot, by the way. I've skipped it every other time, but yeah, cool. So we're in Debian like we expected, and if we reload CasaOS, it's working. Now, what happens if we shut this down and unplug it from the dock? Well, let's find out. All right, so Steam Deck is off. I'm just gonna unplug it really quick. So no screen cap anymore. I'm going to turn it on really quick, and it boots into Clover, which there is no other option here besides SteamOS for Steam Deck. So for some reason, it's not gonna auto boot, I guess. So we can probably just hit A. So not that big of a deal, right? And we'll give it just a minute. All right, and it looks like we booted into SteamOS. Pretty cool. No problems there. Now, a couple things you might be curious about. How much power does it draw, for example? I have a kilowatt meter that it's been plugged into, and I've ran this actually for, well, I reinstalled it all for this video, obviously, but I ran this exact same setup for about 2 or 3 days, and I noticed it only pulled around 8 watts while sitting at idle running Home Assistant. It also ran totally fine for about 2.5 days. I even monitored it using Uptime Kuma. I didn't have any times where it was down. It just sat here doing its Steam Deck server thing, I guess. I don't know where I'm going with this, but yeah, pretty cool. It's cool that you can have this going around gaming, doing your thing, but then when you're not gaming on it, you can still get some more value by having it run some home server stuff. Or if you've used one of these and then decide you never really want to use it again, but you don't want to sell it, yeah, that's cool. It may be kind of silly, it may be gimmicky, and realistically, it might be better to just buy a different device to use as a full-time home server, especially if you have a family that might want to use those services when you're out commuting and playing on your Steam Deck. But still, I think it's cool. I think it was fun to dive into, and I learned quite a bit about SteamOS and the Steam Deck and some Linux stuff. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If not, let me know with one of those guys, but if you did, give me one of those guys. Yeah, and if you want to learn more about CasaOS, you can check out this video here, which like I said, I'll have linked in the description along with a few others. That's about it. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Stay curious, and I hope to see you in the next one.